if the cement industry were a country, it would be like on the top 3 emitters globally, right? 60% are actually because of like this natural dissociation that happens from limestone to calcium oxides and CO2. And that's the hard to abate sort of like emissions, because that's a chemical reaction that you need to do in order to get clinker, right? And then the other 40% of comes from the fossil fuels that you need to burn, because you need to put this kiln at like up to like 1500 degrees Celsius, right? When you think about cement and concrete, cement is like dominated by a few players, right? So the top 4 out of China like dominate quite a big chunk of the market, right? While on the other side, like the concrete is actually like tremendously fragmented. It's a lot of like mom and pop kind of like, let's say, like batching facilities, etc., right? Where these guys like sell into. What matters is actually a lot of like how you integrate into the existing supply chains. And when you think of it, you have like a $1 trillion industry, well, north of $1 trillion industry ready to get disrupted.
Well, today we'll talk about a lot of different topics, but specifically I want to understand with you how the built environment, construction comes with climate tech, right? I think there's a lot of overlap, and ideally by the end of this, we understand how to invest in construction, applying climate tech angle to it, and try to avoid a few mistakes while making a lot of successes, right? As all investors want to do. But before we get there, Juan, can you please quickly introduce yourself?
Hugo and like Tim, this is a big pleasure for me to be here. I've been a big fan of your work over the past couple of years, and I think this is very much needed, because at the end, what happens is like there's very much like an educational barrier, right? On not only on like climate, but also in our industry, which is pretty traditional, as you probably may see, right? But me, coming back to the roots, so born and raised in Madrid, privileged for my accent, Spanish-born, started my career graduating as a civil engineer. I did some internships in construction-related firms, but then quickly moved into my dad's business, which is consulting/technology firm, where I worked for close to a year in the US office. It was nice, but that wasn't like sort of like for me. It's pretty much like a lot of engineers like realized at some point in time is that, okay, financial industry is something which is appealing, since you can like get a lot of like, let's say, of your learnings from an engineer like background applied into sort of like effective like financial assessment and opportunities. So that's why I decided to come back to Europe, particularly to Spain, to one of like Iberia's largest asset managers called Altamar Capital. Back then rebranded to Altamar Cam, and then recently, a couple of months ago, it was acquired by Mercer when they were roughly at like, I think it's like 20 to 25 billion assets under management. So I stayed with that firm for 4 to 4 years, where I was primarily in charge of like more like portfolio strategies on the private equity side of things, fund of funds, but also was sort of like pretty close to one of the very first institutional venture fund of funds programs launched in Europe called Dana Ventures, which actually helped me like to get like a step closer to technology. And just like for context, so when I was a kid, my dad was also always like trying to teach me how to code and everything, right? Have been always like a bit of like a geek of technology. And then is when back in the days, a former colleague of Unit like told me about like an opportunity, which is absolutely about like launching a sort of like corporate fund, what they call like corporate venture capital, into one of the industry largest like corporations. So similarly to here in France, Lafarge, Holcim, Cemex, which stands for like Cementos from Mexico, so Mexican cement, was actually back in 2016 thinking of like launching a venture fund to actually try to understand what the future dynamics of the construction sector is going to look like, since that's the primary industry that they serve, and I'm going to come back into that in a second, but also try to sort of like, let's say, de-risk their company's like future, right? So 2 years down the road, I decided to join that team. Early 2018, I joined Cemex Corporate VC Fund to actually invest in the future of the construction sector. Cemex is actually cement manufacturer. For everyone context, you get a rock which is very much present all across the world, which is limestone. If you crush it and then you burn it, you actually generate a component which is called clinker, which is actually dissociating the limestone into two key components, which is CO2, which is the pollutive aspect of it, which is kind of like, let's say, a bit of like the heavy emitting part of cement, but also the clinker, which is calcium oxides, effectively, right? That calcium oxides, when it gets reacted with, like mixed with water, it actually becomes like a natural glue. And that natural glue is called cement. And when it gets actually mixed with other rocks and other type of sand, you get what's called concrete. concrete is the second most consumed material in the world. It was invented by Romans, but Egyptians actually then sophisticated by Romans, and in pretty much every building or asset that we go through, it has like some certain levels of like concrete, which is basically playing like it's like the natural like Lego sort of like thing, and it has been like a cornerstone of like human being, right? Unfortunately, to date, it's been a very pollutive material, and it's not like we learned recently. I mean, the industry meaning cement industry trying to decarbonize themselves like for quite a few years, but just more recently have realized how much is the impact of it from a carbon emission perspective, which is like roughly 7 to 8% of the global carbon emissions. So if the cement industry were a country, it would be like on the top 3 emitters globally, right?
One question on that is, why does the industry wants to decarbonize? I mean, obviously for me, it feels very important. I think we need to preserve the planet, and I think that's a very core challenge. But if I'm realistic as well, I know that those industries have a very thin margin. And so moving from something that's a bit more maybe expensive, but that has less CO2 emission is probably not compelling, right? So, what's the reason, what's the driver behind this industry to decarbonize?
You get into the tricky questions straight away, which is fantastic. I love it. So basically on that, there's basically two types of like, let's say, forces out there, right? The first force is about like the customer force, right? So there is a certain level of sophisticated customers. I mean, you were working on Microsoft before, right? So Microsoft has probably one of the most, if not the most sophisticated procurement team when it comes to cement procurement, like others in the space like Meta, but also other like players like Disney, for example. So these guys have like deep commitments to their own shareholders, and they wanna, let's say, naturally like want to become like carbon neutral. So these guys are sort of like forcing the industry, which, by the way, it has thin margins, but not on product level. Product levels, cement has like very high margins, but that now is changing because when you think about like Europe, the ETS market, and with other countries like CBAM, etc., right? So they're starting to hinge on like the cement margins, and effectively when the transition on the ETS allowance happens, there's gonna be like sort of like a cut on like half on those high gross like project margins that the cement like has, right? So effectively it comes from two sides. So the customers are pushing for like the cement makers to offer like more, let's say, sophisticated carbon neutral, but also performance driven solutions. So you see like a switch. Typically in cement, you talk about two things, volume and price. More recently, I would say in the last decade, you start to see more like property discussions, right? That's on one end, and the other end, on the regulatory side of things, there is like a specific like carbon friendly, like it's like not carbon friendly, that won't be the word, but they see effective government level like type of pushes, or like even like beyond like government level, which are like pushing this like cement industry to decarbonize, and is hitting this gas P&L, right? So that's like the two major forces. Look, when I joined Cemex, the sustainability department was there for like more than 20 years. And what we realized...
What were they doing before? Sorry to ask.
That's a good question. A lot of things actually, from like additives that actually like remove the clinker, like reduce the amount of like clinker used in cement. Like just coming specifically into cement, that clinker, the bases are like roughly splitting like 40, 60. 60% are actually because of like this natural dissociation that happens from limestone to let's say calcium oxides and CO2. And that's the hard to abate sort of like emissions, because that's like a chemical reaction that you need to do in order to get clinker, right? And then the other 40% of the emissions, like 30 comes from the fossil fuels that you need to burn, because you need to put this kiln at like up to like 1500 degrees Celsius, right? And that's a lot of heat that can only allow by like fossil fuels, right? So they have been trying to actually like focus initially on like reducing this clinker factor. So like improving on the later and the formulations to actually like reduce the amount of cement being used in concrete, but also actually increasing the amount of alternative flows from like city waste to other like type of like, let's say, waste streams, which is actually circular by itself, to actually like remove the amount or like reduce the amount of like fossil fuels being used on the heating, right? But then coming back into my like personal history, that's when we realized a lot of like the technologies that we needed to fully decarbonize cement back in 2016, 17, 18, all the way to where we are today, didn't exist, right? And that's when like we're like tremendously lucky, starting out of like 5 people team, scaled the way of like 20 plus team. We made like close to like 25 investments. We did like a lot of like stuff like on the full like open innovation stuff for corporates, like venture building, venture acceleration, whatsoever, right? But we realized one thing, which is like you can do a lot of like things by your own, but on this, let's say, segment of the industry, emerging technologies, startups, venture, etc., venture capital, as the word like says, there is a lot of like risk into doing what we do. And corporations, particularly like the large corporates in a super traditional industry like construction, infrastructure, real estate, etc., they are not willing to take so much risk, right? And that's how me and one of my colleagues back then in Cemex, Mauricio, but also another guy like doing exactly the same as another like large corporation called Hilti, mostly on power tools in the Bay Area, we decided to set up Zacua Ventures with the ambition of, okay, everyone is facing like the same challenge in this build environment, sort of like the same mandate. There is lack of skilled labor. Projects cost more year over year, and it never comes down. It is very hard to get like permittings done. It is very hard to keep up with the humanity demands on topics like housing affordability, getting the grid to your home, heating, cooling your home like effectively, but also getting the infrastructure needed just to transport, to live like comfortably, right? And all those challenges has something in common, which is like there is no technologies that can support and that get adopted fast enough to actually be able to sort that out. And that's why when we came the idea of Zacua, so we said like, why don't we put together a vehicle which is actually able to get the best of the two worlds? On one side, the entrepreneurs, the brilliant minds, and on the other side, some of the world's largest conglomerates in this build environment, construction, infrastructure, real estate, etc., which might be able to actually like pair together and boost the adoption of like the right companies, while we as a fund is going to leverage this to take more informed investment decisions, help the companies scale, and eventually exit to these guys, right? So we set up that vehicle with ambition to raise like 30 to 40 million. We end up like raising close to 60 on very tough timelines for venture industry, like 2022, 2023. So very sort of like dry vintages, post all this like 2020 to 2022 bubble. But we managed to pull it together just because we're having like a very like, let's say, a specific mandate. We're domain experts. We're backed by the right logos, like words like Cemex, whether it's like other players like Volvo, other players like MTR, the largest like railway builder in the world, and some of the world's largest contractors, OEMs, building material suppliers coming from different backgrounds, but also different regions globally, right? So in Fund 1, we got like close to 20 investors coming from like let's say random regions from like South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, all across Europe, Latin America, but also North America. And we started deploying capital, right? So from a focus perspective, we picked like 3 key areas, which is the same areas that we have today, which is productivity. So trying to bring the productivity levels up, effectively bringing the efficiency up, therefore like reducing like the broader like climate impact of one of the most, if not the most asset intensive industry in the world. Since at the end we spend like 90% of our time under a roof, which means you need to move materials from one place to the other to create those roofs and infrastructure and everything, right? That's the first bucket. The second bucket is about decarbonization or like broader like sustainability. So from materials to processes to emissions abatement to even like understanding where the emissions are coming from. And just for everyone's context, like the built environment contributes to close to 40% of the global carbon emissions. Out of that, most is coming from like 2 key materials, or for like human being, which is cement, as we call concrete. Cement and concrete is 2 different materials. We can come back to that later, but also steel. And then fundamentally, let's say asset management, right? So when you heat or when you cool a building, you are consuming a lot of energy, and all of that energy comes still from fossil, let's say, sources, right? And still, we are also consuming a lot of materials to build new stock. While, for example, in Europe, you can just renovate all the existing stock and avoid a lot of, like, let's say, material, usage, right? And that was the second big bucket. And the third bucket is what we call industrial resiliency, right? So all these like segments has like the industry backing them, whether like it's material, whether it's like equipment, whether it's like power tools, whether it's like whatsoever. So these industries needs to actually like progress and advance, right? And when you go, say what you probably have gone to quite a few, like a steel mill, like a cement facility, a concrete batching facility, like a tile manufacturer, right? Or like a precast facility, whatsoever, like a lot of like these like gas facilities, you basically feel like you're probably like 100 years like ago instead of like now, right? So there is, I wouldn't say that there is zero adoption of technology, but these guys have been doing nicely on their businesses, so they are not like, let's say, motivated to adopt new technologies, right? So that was the first vehicle that we finished deploying like sort of like mid last year. We kick off the launch of the second vehicle, which is the one from which we are deploying now. And we have invested on quite a few very interesting like plays on the more like the climate and sustainability stack, right? So we have invested on like a micro sustainable data center play called FlexNode out of the US. We have Cemex invested in a company which is using AI to actually understand where the emissions are coming from at material level automatically putting together environmental product declarations and doing life cycle assessments called Pathways, or that's out of New York City. We have invested in quite a few circularity/building material plays. We were discussing before about Cura, which is a very interesting electrochemical lever to decarbonize the feedstock of cement, which is limestone, but also comes with a very interesting play for cement and a couple other like batteries, concrete for chains, which is carbon mineralization, or like Vision, which is actually using like a steel or like mining like tailwinds to just like create like a novel binder, right? Those are just like a few examples, but also there, for example, there's one company over here, this Leonard event, which is a company called EcoWorks, which what they are doing is as simple as it sounds, but they are like plugging a second skin on top of existing like multifamily residential buildings to turn those carbon neutral. And without actually like getting anyone out of the building in order to do that renovation. And that's a renovation that usually takes, let's say 18 months. They do it in 6 weeks. And they get your like sort of energy certificate from the lowest level all the way to the toppest level, right? So it's kind of like, let's say, a carbon, let's say, neutral play to decarbonize real estate assets at scale, right? Those are just like a few of the investments that we have done as a sample. I guess like it comes to me, and I'm probably kind of like maybe redirecting the discussion to where you want, is like everything that we are doing on the built environment has a massive impact. And all this impact is translating to actually like reducing that 40% like emission contribution, right? But it's so hard to do because a lot of like stakeholders are there. It's such a project-based industry. Very lack of like, let's say, very lack of willingness to adopt technology. It's not like pretty much every contractor is like fancy here, right? So we're still on like this early days educational period. When I compare this when I started in 2017-18, we are a lot better than back then.
I'm actually curious on that. Like, what are some of the progress that you've seen companies do in the last, I would say, 10 years, so to say, when it comes to pushing new materials to market, be it concrete, cements, new processes, you know, like things that are actually making progress? Because the thing is, like we've seen countless numbers of companies trying to decarbonize concrete, for example.
Yes.
It is incredibly hard. You will tell me more about the details as to why, but in general, I haven't seen that many large companies that have achieved scale, because the thing is like it's good to have massive impact on CO2 emissions per kilos when you're in the lab, but what has actually an impact on the world is when you get to scale and actually replace some of the materials that are existing in tons and megatons, right?
Yes.
So what are some of the, I would say, success stories that we've seen the last 10 years?
Look, there is quite a few, and maybe just coming back of like a point of contact. So when I started, like when we started like Cemex, corporate BCM, Cemex Ventures, there were like no other, maybe just one out of like the top 40 like cement investors with like innovation, investment, open innovation sort of like activities. Right now, I would say like 80% of like the top 40 like cement makers in the world has this kind of like, so right now at least they have the mean to deal with this, right? When you think about success stories, I mean, just like I think it was like 4 to 5 months ago, there was announced the acquisition of Eco Materials by CRH. I think it was like 2-ish like billion, which is one of the I guess largest like supplementary cementitious materials, which is like cement replacement kind of like thing in the world. So that's like very interesting one. We have seen here like more locally like companies like Match Up, like Hoffman Green, starting to just get into like the sizable kind of like the same tonnage like production. We are starting to talk about like thousands or like even like millions on some cases of like tonnage. On the other like material side of things, we have seen quite a few like push into like transitioning from like blast furnace to electric arc furnaces on the steel side of things. And here in Europe, we have like one of the most interesting like plays on that segment, which is like formerly H2 Green Steel, now is Tegra, right? But also, you know, the verticals, like for example, like these segments in the, like a key component of like a building, particularly like from like, I guess, France to top in Europe is like the insulation, but even in Spain, right? We're still isolating buildings with like mineral wool, which is basically rock crust, right? Which is like nonsense to me, right? There has been a lot of innovation recently on kind of like, let's say, aerial style type of like insulation, a lot thinner, but with like, let's say, thermal breaks, which are like a lot better, right? So we're starting to see quite a few like interesting cases of like companies growing like so rapidly. And look, to me, like the biggest change now versus like 10 years is that the amount of interest that this segment is actually getting from more the generalist, large pocketed investors has dramatically changed in the last 18 months. Before, all the blue chip names in venture capital, what you mean like Sequoia, Anderson Horowitz, Bessemer, whatsoever, right? But also the blue chip names on like the asset management like a space like EQT, all these like, let's say massive like Bill Gates, like all the like Sergey Brin, like all these like, let's say massive like family office, which are like, let's say massive like capital allocators, but also the endowments and the likes. And even Temasek, like pension funds, they are starting to bet heavily on this. So whether you guys saw like Tira CO2 round, where my former colleagues at Cemex like participated, but like, it was sponsored actually by Temasek in Singapore, right? So now you're starting to see the big pockets starting to put attention into this, right?
And just, I want to pick your brain on that, because my thought process when I hear that is AI has taken over software. Software has become a commodity. It is harder and harder for, I would say, your typical software as a service company to make money or to be differentiated, because AI can reproduce some of that. And as a result, I feel like some of the investors that were more generalists before investing in software are thinking, wait a minute, actually, if we invest in physical world stuff, things that actually exist, that have hard technology behind it, that have years of research and years of science, maybe that's where we can actually be a bit more differentiated. The moat is higher, and maybe that creates category winners in very large markets, and that's how they will make money. Would you say that's the only driver of that change of the Sequoia of the world coming into the physical world, and more specifically into construction and what you're dealing with today? Or is there any other driver behind it?
Look, I think what I hear from what you just said, which is like an interesting way of looking at it, because like I quite like it, which is like the education or like the realization from like the others, which has like a very quick way of like recurrently making money out of like the venture programs. It's like, okay, they just need to move into physical things, right? Look, I think it's related to that, but a lot of this is like when you think of like a macro and where like humans are hitting into, like what is AI, what is all these like space missions, what is like topics which are like more naive somehow to say, right? Which is getting a house, housing affordability, and everything that has to do with like getting the grid ready, getting the water to your home, and I mean, what all of that has in common, and even like right now with a push on defense and push on like more like, let's say, rare metals and all these topics, all this has in common is that you need to actually build and operate physical assets. So for me, if anyone has been ignoring this and they are just jumping into this wave now, they are probably late. What I think this is like opening is like a lot of like good opportunities for like more like the segment specific investors like yourselves and probably us, which is like, okay, we understand this segment, we understand what's the nitty gritty behind this and these industries and what's going to power this, right? So we might not want to invest on the, let's say, OpenAI or like Anthropic kind of like, let's say, IPOs. But all these IPOs, what is effectively unlocking is a lot of industries on the back, which is like what is like data center, what is like the energy, like the grid, what is like the water treatment, what is like the cooling technologies, like the chips, and all that cascades back into like industries that I guess like the segment specific vehicles like deeply understand. And that's what I'm most excited about. I mean, the transition, this is not gonna, I mean, I was like listening on this like McKinsey summit to this lady from like one of the largest Northern European like investors, like a Nordic investor, is like, yeah, we invested in all these like flashy companies in 2020 to 2022, which were thinking that the electrification thing is gonna happen like, and now right now we realize, okay, no, that electrification is not happening that quickly. We need to invest on electrifying, right? To me, I like actually like the piece will be like upside down, right? Okay, right now when you feel like electrification is going to happen and there's going to be big pockets deploying into that and investing into that, you need to really invest on these like shiny technologies that when this electrification effectively happens, they can actually like shine, right? And we come back into the case of Cura that we're commenting, this Canadian company, right? So these guys, when they're effectively, there is like a good sort of like, let's say, input or like throughput of like, let's say, renewable electricity. If these guys achieve what they seem to be close to achieving, which is this efficiency on the cells, because of this acid agent that they use in the plates for this, I guess like electrochemist kind of like, let's say aspect of like splitting this limestone into like this quicklime. I think that is going to be effectively like the technologies that you want to be invested when this electrification effectively happens, right? Because like the others are just like means for these guys to create and sort of like dominate a market. In this case, it's actually this new cement market, right?
Do you think only specialist investors can think a step ahead? In other words, if you're a generalist, don't you think you're always late to the party? Because as you said,
100%.
right, like I think what I find interesting in that discussion is to say the world is electrifying. Yes, for sure. Everybody knows that. I don't think that's new. Then the question is more, what does that unlock? Which could be the thing for Kura, for example, rather than, okay, let's now invest in electrification because we're late anyway. The technologies that are going to drive the next 10 years of electrification are mostly already have been financed at least at pre-seed, seed, maybe Series A type of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think only specialist investors can see that step ahead kind of thing?
Look, yes and no, in the sense that at the end, like if you think of like fundamentally your venture business, it's about like access, analyze, win, and support, right? The blue chip brands will still like have the access, right? And at the end, it's a competition for like the best managers or like the best talent, right? So I'm not saying like a lot of like this, but I think fundamentally what changes between like a generalist and a specialist is that you might understand things that they might usually pass on. So on that, like kind of like, let's say, look into the forest in between the trees is where like a specialist like ourselves like can shine, while the generalist might kind of like, let's say, move away, right? And by deeply understanding these industries, you can also kind of like anticipate like 1-2 steps. It's like, okay, what you guys fundamentally what you see like on the build environment, like on these like physical industries, that adoption takes a lot of time because risk is immense. So if you fucked up with building this bridge, which is connecting X1 and Z, you can actually like kill people, right? So it's not like it's not like, okay, I'm gonna define this test environment for this software. I'm gonna just like play or like on the fintech side of things, like a lot of sandbox, etc. No. Here we are talking about real world, real people, real assets, physical assets. So the, let's say, risk tolerance is definitely lower. And that's why like I think like a specialist can anticipate 1, 2, or 3 steps ahead of like what are the challenges that you are gonna face and how you can sort of like go around those challenges, right? And particularly on the cement side of things, when you think about it, like at least when I started, I mean, which I was new. I mean, obviously I got my cement chemistry and my materials chemistry class as civil engineer, right? But I didn't realize that it was such an like intricate, like and complicated industry. When you think about cement and concrete, cement is like dominated by a few players, right? So the top 4 out of China like dominate quite a big chunk of the market, right? And if you include the Chinese, it's like a massive one, right? While on the other side, like the concrete is actually like tremendously fragmented. It's a lot of like mom and pop kind of like, let's say, like patching facilities, etc., right? Where these guys like sell into. So it doesn't matter if you have the best chemistry. It doesn't matter if you have like the best like specifics. It even doesn't matter if you have the best price, right? What matters is actually a lot of like how you integrate into the existing supply chains. And because a lot of this is like, okay, it's very traditional industry that is based on trust, that they're not going to risk their like business by trying this new material or new whatsoever, because it's better price, it's better property whatsoever. They're going to change it actually, the customer asks for it, right?
And how do we deal and how do we replace such an incumbent, or how do we manage to fight against very, very large companies? Because in that space, as you said, it's dominated by a few players, which makes it a very tough road to market for startups because they don't have the budget, they don't have the capabilities, they don't
100%.
have the distribution, they don't have the network, they don't have the trust. How do you advise your startups? What have you seen work with the startups that you've invested in so far in terms of like pushing products into those controlled markets or those monopoly, so to say?
Yeah, and there is a number of barriers on that, right? If you break it down, there is like the regulatory barriers, right? Which is, okay, you need to get your materials like be able to be deployed, right? There is also the property barriers, right? So the properties needs to match like existing like material properties. There is the supply chain, as we commented, right? I mean, ideally your approach like fits into existing supply chain. If you need to create like everything like from scratch, it's going to be very tough because all these big players like dominate like the trucks, dominate like the ports, dominate the shipping lines. So you're not going to be able like to just fit into that, right? And but fundamentally at the end, like what you can shine is like by being faster than them, being smarter about your product positioning, but also your branding, and also be able to sort of like collaborate effectively when it makes sense, right? At the end, I mean, I always feel like the startup job is like pretty tough because you're always like dealing with like imbalanced negotiations, right? So you talk with these guys that have like a massive organization like 30, 40, 50,000 employee people, massive legal teams, compliance, procurement, whatsoever, and you come with like a 5 to 10 people team, right? So what you're gonna do? So you need to play a lot of like the 80-20s. But at the end, if you play smartly and if you're able like to leverage like the right levers and just let the kind of like, let's say, natural course of things like just go, you might be able to succeed. I guess there is a lot of like time to market kind of like, let's say, aspect of it, right? And we have seen like a number of like waves already.
How does that affect an investor return? Because that's the thing.
Yeah.
Those industries are very long sales cycle. It takes a lot of time to get a product out to market. Like it's not trivial. It's not your typical SaaS company that you can develop and then a month later, a week later, a day later, you can push to the market, you test it, kind of thing. For those products, it takes time, and the customer you have in front of you are not going to be signing anything before they've tested the product 1,000 times, right?
And there's a lot of chicken and egg, right? I mean, I'm going to test it. So in order to test it, I need to produce it. How am I going to produce it if I'm not able to raise money? If I want to raise money, I need to get someone which is willing to pay, right? So there's sort of like this, like sort of like you don't know where to enter, like the circle, right? Look, I think as we commented, you probably need, you always like need to play smartly, right? And at the end, like, I mean, this guy's drive comes by like playing like smartly, but also get the most talented individuals like being able to work in conjunction, which is something that sometimes is hard for these big incumbents, right? So be appealing, right? And just go one step at a time, right? So it's like I see a lot of like companies trying to jump from A to D, and that's like it's not gonna happen, right? Sometimes maybe in other days where you can get like a lot of money can just bite steps, but it can actually not solve like the fundamental issues of this like adoption that takes time, right? So you just need to be mindful that these times take longer, but also the rewards are longer, right? So if you feel like coming back to the like cement and concrete example, like both industries together is like 1.2, 1.4 trillion. So you are talking about like being on like the top 10, like top 20, like let's say, sort of like if you were a country, like on those ranks, right? So there is like a massive like deployment potential, but in order to capture that, you need to go step by step, right? And it's not like, okay, this place I have like larger deployment cycles, which they have. If you play smartly, you can just get the right accelerators, right? As I always say, like coming back again into this, so there is like a test that you need to do in order to validate concrete performance, so like 17, 14, 28 days, etc., right? And you need to do that on a number of like formulas and a number of environments, on a number of like water levels, a number of like whatsoever, right? That, yeah, I mean, you can do it like in parallel, etc., and just match, but for that you need a lot of equipment. For all that equipment, you need a lot of capital, right? So you can get, a capital can accelerate certain things, but there is certain timelines on the industry that cannot be accelerated, right? And that's why you really need to pick which battles you're going to pick. And then if you play smartly, you're going to get there, right? And I think like here in Europe, we have like quite a few interesting kind of like, let's say, programs to accelerate these things, but also your former like colleagues at Microsoft, they had like quite a few like interesting programs to as well accelerate some of those deployments, right? So sometimes it's only like finding like one progressive sort of like influence and stakeholder that can just push you, and that is going to give you sort of like, let's say, time or like accelerator for the next like 3 to 5 years. And that's what you effectively need in order to succeed.
I'm curious, just going back to what you were saying previously on the approach that you have to have as a startup, being small, being focused. It feels like there's a bit of, at least in Europe, like talking about H2 Green Steel's Tegra.
Yes.
I have the understanding, I'm not close to the company, so I might be wrong, but have the understanding that their story is to say they've raised massive amount of capital and then they went straight into it with like already large factories from the get-go, which created probably some struggles. It feels like they've fixed that, but like they have gone with this approach, which is like, let's go big and break things and let's make it work, versus another approach, which would be rather test in the lab, test a kilo, test 100 kilo, test a ton. What's the right approach?
Yeah.
And maybe I'm wrong with Tegra, right? But
yeah,
that's the feeling I have.
And maybe just keep it like that specific like company name, right? Look, I've seen that approach like a number of times being unsuccessful. I've seen that approach a number of times also being successful, So I think it comes down to the time to market, to also like getting right your like go to market. I mean, there is people which are born to sort of like change industries and turn like worlds. I think it comes down to just getting those like talented like individuals together, right? But I haven't come into sort of like, let's say, a formula where we advise our founders like similarly, hey, what to do, what not to do. Unfortunately, right? It's very much bespoke. It comes down into the manager's personality. And at the end, like fundamentally, it comes down to be able to attract the best talent, right? And I think one of the difference between like 10 years ago and then today is that this segment, like built environment and particularly construction industry, has been able to attract great talent. While most recently, I would say like 2 to 3 years, when people start seeing like some of these big successes, a lot of like this, even like if you think about like some of last year's and early this year's large IPOs like Service Titan, and then some more years ago like Procore, and like all these guys. So I mean, these guys have raised like quite a bit of like billions, and it's always like build environment, right? So there is a massive like, and that is actually attracting like other talent individuals from other industries to look into this. So that's probably like my common recommendation or common recommendation to our portfolio companies: try to attract the best talent and then leverage partners with when it matters, right? So across our funds, we have like close to 40 of the world's largest conglomerates in the middle environment as investors. So a lot of times you can get a lot of like benefits of like being close to them. Sometimes they are more like a kind of like, let's say, an overhead for you versus like a lever. But if you play those relations smartly when it matters, and particularly the right people among those organizations, I think you can get quite a few accelerations like in place, right? But I don't think I have like a conclusive kind of like, let's say, opinion. Okay, what's the best approach in here? Unfortunately, and would love to learn about your experience as well on that one, right?
I wouldn't dare to comment. I think it's a case by case study, but still asking the question. Let's go back because I feel like you have identified, or at least like there's two key materials, three maybe: concrete, cement, and steel, that are the core of what the construction industry relies on. Or to your point earlier, I think these are the very, very large industries. And I'd love for you to help me technically go into this topic. So if we start with concrete and cements, what are some of the, let's say, top 5 technical challenges that startups are going after today? You probably see a lot of them. They're probably all coming to you for investment. What are we trying to solve, both from a climate perspective, but also from a performance perspective, price perspective?
Mm-hmm. Look, fundamentally right now, the cement industry is on this interesting like point where like margins are starting to compress. There is still like a massive demand, and that's expected only to increase for like cement and concrete as materials. And there is a lot of pressure towards the industry to decarbonize. Well, that pressure is coming, as we said, from like the end customer, or that pressure is coming because of the regulators pushing for that, right? So I think like typically when we encounter startups, they are trying to just go after like making the material, I guess, more efficient. And that comes only to having like better properties, or like use less materials or use like recycled materials. There is like companies which are trying to kind of like, let's say, deal with the emissions, probably kind of like, let's say, more from a downstream point of things, which is like capture and utilizing like the CO2 for doing something. There is companies which are trying to minimize the use of these materials on certain applications and aspects, which is we call like the supplementary cementitious materials. And there is companies which are actually like trying to create these neo binders, right? The new glue of the concrete and the like materials, right? So that's fundamentally the 4 approaches that we see out there, like 3 to 4 like archetypes. All of them are just trying to get like a material which is like more efficient, ideally is cheaper, ideally is like better in properties, right? And ideally is kind of like, let's say, lighter on emissions. That's a bit of it. I guess like the industry has like gone also through like a maturation like period where you see like all these guys focusing like on its early days on like CCUS, that went away. There's still some ones like betting big on that. Then like there's quite a few like betting big on electrification, which is interesting to see. There's quite a bit of like betting big on like reducing the clinker factor, so these SCMs reducing the amount of cement. And there's quite a few which are actually like thinking of like alternative like materials, right? So we commented about like cement and concrete, but also steel, but also like wood is like probably available like naturally grown material, where like used effectively it can be like also like a challenger of certain, let's say, steel and concrete applications, right?
Are you an investor in Strong by Foam?
No, but I'm a big fan of Andres, and we followed them since its early days, almost not since like he was still at uni, and then like a local like wood company helped them to sort of like, let's say, fund it, but we're very close to all their like 3 large like wood investors and also a few that have looked at them, right? And
what are some of within that stack? What are the one or two things that you're very excited about today? Are they things that you're looking for
in wood?
I mean, more like around concrete, cement, and alternative materials.
Yes, definitely. Look, I mean, we try to position to sort of play bets on a bit of the very much all the archetypes. Obviously, what I'm most excited about is when the material is better, property-wise, when the material is cheaper, I guess from a cost perspective, right? But also when it's effectively less pollutive, right? So when all these three come together, which they don't come together often, just very little times, is when I get truly excited, right? And when you think of it, you have a $1 trillion industry, well, north of $1 trillion industry ready to get disrupted. And then you can probably let's say, bet on some of the category winners. Might not be able to cover the whole segment of the industry, but this is just calling let's say 0.1% of that. You are talking about hundreds of billions of potential impact that company can do. So that's what excites me the most about cement and concrete. Still, I would say it's a slightly different segment because there is not this hard to abate kind of emissions, which is more the process emission, the CO2 split emissions, the carbonation emissions. Is actually a bit of okay, what's the fossil fuels that the industry is using, right? But that is actually exposing other challenges, right? From energy intensity, from throughput, from availability of renewables, etc., right? So it's a more a straightforward decarbonization, I will say. But that is also opening other avenues, okay, how you can transport and how you can transform the energy forms quicker, right? What is H2 plays, what is electrochemistry plays. And there's quite a bit of interesting ones over there, right? And steel is not only a core component of buildings, infrastructure, etc., but also a lot of what we do cars, even these microphones and these headsets, right? So there's quite a bit of interesting one, and the steel industry is also, it can be naturally circular in the sense that you can just recuperate a lot of the steel from the scrap and just produce it over and over again, almost on, let's say, unlimited times, which is not something that you can do with concrete, unfortunately. I wish at some point we could, right? And then when you think about other verticals, so wood is a very interesting one. The challenge with wood is it has some maybe perception challenge. Here in France, I think it's similar to Spain. I mean, people don't really want to build with wood a lot of times just because they perceive it can get fired. It's worse acoustic, worse thermal isolation, but properly done, what stone by form is doing, it can be actually almost looking at parallel materials, right? So that is something that is exciting, but it's an industry that is very slow changing. So you don't, even if you have a better material on properties, on cost, and also decarbonize, it's not going to be straightforward. Since you need to actually get the owners to be convinced to ask those material to their contractors, to their engineers, and those they need to ask their installers to actually handle them. So there's a bit of a cascade process that needs to happen, which is not day and night. And I've seen some super cool things just going past because it doesn't really happen, right? The good thing right now, and that's what I'm very excited about our segment, is when you think about the conjunction of things, okay, all these material topics that we discuss, in conjunction with being a very, let's say, human-heavy industry, with AI and physical AI coming up, there is a labor shortage that we need to fill, and there is robots which are starting to take over some human activities, right? So robots don't have the burdens that human has. If I'm, let's say, a bricklayer, and someone tells me, hey, start working with wood instead of concrete bricks or clay-made bricks, I'm going to say no. But if I'm a robot, and if I'm designed for robot assembly, I don't care. I will do whatever this guy. So there is a big of conjunction of things where the labor shortages, the pressure to be building more on housing, on infrastructure, on data center, on the grid, but also the innovation of materials can come all together and push off this adoption for new technologies. And that's where when we're talking about, okay, there is people which is investing, yes, I'm going to electrify. I'm going to invest on these, let's say, robotic companies. Well, there's other people which is actually investing on the segments which are going to power that. For example, we are now on the in a very advanced process to hopefully close a very exciting investment on a company which is actually orchestrating robotic fleets, but also trying to debug and try to understand where the robots are failing because at the end, in all these like let's say human heavy industries, if a robot is like stuck like doing something or it like fails, it can be like a big like let's say economic loss. But most importantly, it can put at risk like human lives. So being able to debug instantly is tremendously important. So that is how we are thinking about these segments, right?
It's an interesting one because I really wonder where robots, climate, and the built environment will come together. I mean, few things that comes to mind: robots to help deploy solar panels, robots to help clean them and maintain them. We've seen a lot of drones to help with wind farm as well and maintenance. So like there are a few avenues that I could see happening. But curious, have you seen anything interesting in that space?
Yes, particularly what you said. I mean, you were spot on. You like there's one company which is called Lumic Robotics, which is like LumaView, which is also sort of like similar to Cosmic Robotics. And what these companies are actually helping is like to deploy these like massive solar farms, but also operate those solar farms, right? And a bit of like these ones are able like to kind of like let's say effectively deploy faster, but also take care of these like solar farms like more effectively, right? We have seen like companies which are actually like yes, effectively like robotizing like the foundation building of like these like massive aeolic farms. There is quite a bit of innovation, or like let's say offshore like wind facilities. There is also innovation like the end of life of all these like let's say aeolic assets, right? Since like a lot of like these like wind blades typically get like it end up like landfill, and you were surprised. I mean, where like those like 30-meter like long, let's say blade ends up, is actually ends up like under the soil in somewhere. So there's quite a few like interesting technologies over there. I would say like where robots has kind of like let's say we have defined like sort of like three big archetypes for the robots to be deployed in the built environment and in construction infrastructure, specifically in real estate, which is like the ones who what we call like the scouts. So fundamentally, in order to place a robot in an environment like a construction job site, which is moving, whether it's humans, etc., you need to understand what is out there, right? And you need to get the contextual information for the positioning layers to come in. So you get the context. You get actually the second layer, which is how you position yourself on that context. And you get the third layer is like after understanding how is the environment, how you position, how to handle with all these like pieces, right? So the scouts are the ones who are effectively able to capture all that information. That's the first archetype. The second one is actually about what they call like the plotters. So you can actually guide humans or other robots doing their job. So let's say that I'm going to help with the layout. I'm going to help with like certain kind of like, let's say 3D printing technologies to just start like building certain stuff, right? And there is like the other ones which are like the grinders, which is what obviously we are more excited about, which is like the highly repetitive, highly, let's say dollar value, and some of the most dangerous type of like task, which actually is just like, to me, is just like nonsense that humans are still like carry over like and you think about bricklaying, these guys get their backs like fucked like super quick just because you're like continuously carrying over like let's say this whatever like kilo kind of like brick, right? And these companies like doing that in Australia, like Fast Bricks. Here in Europe we go like we always hear about like Monument, and there's quite a few others like in the US, right? So those are like a straightforward kind of like let's say companies which are taking. We haven't seen yet like a holistic kind of like let's say solution. There is one over here called Field AI, which is taking on certain tasks, which is okay. It's like it's just like displays like a human doing everything that a human could do on a job site. We are not yet there, but I expect we are like soon to be there, right? I wouldn't like put a timeline. I'm gonna don't want to tuck my fingers over there, right? But I'm starting to be more excited about this, right? And also the education on the incumbents deploying those things. You weren't seeing robot procurement teams on these large contractors like 3 years ago. By now, some of the top leading contractors, they have robot procurement teams already, right? Which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
So we have seen like Amazon, like let's say automating other warehouses. Okay, we are probably kind of like let's say 5 to 10 years behind that from like an industry perspective, right?
I love it. Well, look, I think I've learned a lot already with you today on the intersection of climate tech and the built environment. To wrap it up today, what do we leave people with? What's the one thing that people should remember from this episode?
Look, at least to me, what I find most, what I typically find myself like most excited about is like where we are gonna live to the generations that are coming. I'm at the personal level, I'm father of like 2 small daughters, 4 and 1. And me and my wife are expecting a third kid. We don't know whether it's going to be a girl or a boy. Hopefully I get a boy.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We'll see. But at the end, like when I think of them, look, we have been tremendously grateful. I think you and I were sort of like close age, right? So I've seen a world which everything has been built. We managed to live under a roof. We managed to get like food immediately. We managed to get a lot of like comfort. And we're always obviously we are very lucky. We live on developed economies, right? I just feel like when I think on like, let's say 10, 20, 30 years from now, what a fan like us with a vision like us can achieve is build this legacy about, okay, how we can just leave to all these people which is coming after us a more resilient, a more safer, and a more kind of like, let's say, structured like way of like building and operating assets. It is totally unfair that in some of the most developed economies, there's people that cannot even like afford like a house anymore, right? It's unfair that people is not able to get like clean water to their homes, electricity, internet, whatsoever, right? The disparities are just becoming bigger. And this fundamentally comes because we haven't yet engineered a way to build and operate repeatedly, right? And on a standardized manner, right? I'm not sure whether we are going to be able like to leave all that impact to the generations to come. I just feel with our small contribution to like educating the environment and making sure that the people understand that everything that we are doing on these sort of like, let's say, foundational industries, which at the end typically employ like anywhere between 5 to 20% of like the workforce of every like developed economy and contribute like close to 10% of the GDP, that is foundational. And this can be improved dramatically, but since there is always like a lot of like stakeholders involved, we all need to actually contribute smallly into this, right? So just coming into another example, and sorry for deviating on the conversation here, but this company which is actually enabling the, let's say, climate or like the sustainable home renovations in Europe, right? And is supporting from a financing perspective, right? So I just feel solutions like this are playing a capital role for us to actually transition to this more like resilient built environment, like economy, right? And that comes with like adoption as well, right? So if we are not taking the leap and the risk to just adopt this like first, we as the new generations, the generations that will come behind us, won't have like the same, let's say, rights and grants that we were granted with, right? So that's a bit of like my takeaway from today. Everything that we are doing is foundational to ourselves, but also the generations that are coming. And let's hope that we can leave a better world for these generations that are coming.
I love this. Yeah. I mean, I sometimes say that the climate crisis is the biggest humanitarian crisis that we have. I think people sometimes forget that the planet is going to live long after we are all done, right? That's not the issue that we're trying to fix. It's rather to how do we make sure that the human species is able to live on this planet in a certain level of comfort, so to say.
100%. And that's why I told you like before we jump into the podcast, but I'm a big fan of your educational work that you do on LinkedIn, just because I just feel like people don't really look beyond what it shows on like the press and like the news. There's quite a few like interesting readings on the back, right? On like what all this climate economy can unlock, right? And there is a lot of like economic value that can unlock, right? And 100%. I think you individuals like yourself are contributing a lot to this. So big fan of that. And
trying my best. But well, thank you so much for today. If people want to reach out to you, LinkedIn is the best way. Email?
LinkedIn.
Do you want to give your email? Maybe?
Yes, Juan@zacuaventures.com. Straightforward. I have it on LinkedIn. So
perfect.
And LinkedIn, I'm very fast as well. So
fantastic.
I'm always connected.
And listeners, if you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube, or to give us a follow and a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Juan, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.